Hello. Now we are going to talk about the custom sequence. So we have already discussed about the custom sequence and we have implemented length and get item method. But we can also implement other method as well. Like we can implement the concatenations. We can implement in-place concatenations. We can do the repetition and in-place repetition. We have already done the indexing and the slicing with the get item method. We can also implement the append, extend, in operator, delete and pop method, right? So we have this lots of functionality and you can implement all this functionality based on the requirement. Let's try to implement some of these. So here, first we are going to talk about this plus and plus equal to operator. So in general, first we'll discuss a basics of plus and plus equal to operator, and then we'll try to implement the same concept with our sequence date or with our sequence class. First, now to implement the plus operator, we have this add method, and to implement plus equal to operator, we have this iadd method, right? So let's try to run this. First, here we are getting a class. Now again, the init and repair method is there. Now we have this add method and if method we have implemented. In the add method, we can see that we are just printing. Here we are just printing the plus operator that we are calling on the self and the other object, right? And then it will return hello from add. Now in the iadd method, again we are printing just the two objects, and then it will call hello from iadd method. Let's call this. Now let's create two instances over here, the C1 and C2. Here we are getting two instances, right? Now when we do C1 plus C2, it will automatically do, so it will automatically create a new object that we know, right? So when we do C1 plus C2, it will call the add method over here, right? And when we call C1 plus equal to C2, it will call iadd method. Let's try to implement this here, and we call this, we are printing it, right? We have seen that you have called the plus operator, the same print we are getting, and then we can also check the C3 value, hello from iadd, and again let's see that here the C1 and C2 object has not changed, right? Now when we do C1 plus equal to C2, this will mutate the C1 object, but it will not create a new object. So here let's do this. And again, when we call this operator plus equal to, again you can check that it has called the iadd method, and then we are calling you call plus equal to. Here we can get this, right? And again, if you check the C1 object, you should get hello from iadd, right? Now let's tweak the same code to concatenate the name property. But before that, let's try to quickly see how these operators work with the list object. So here we have created a two list, L1 and L2, right? And then let's check the ID of L1. The ID of L1 is this. Now when we do L1 plus L2, and then we are saying that L1 equal to L1 plus L2, right? So this, if we'll use this plus operator, this will create a new object. That means if the new object will be created, ID of L1 will be changed. Here we can check that the ID has changed, right? But again, let's try to implement the same thing with the plus equal to operator. Again, we are creating the L1. The ID is this time. Now when we do L1 plus equal to L2, and then when we check the ID, we can see that the ID is still the same. So it's like new object has not created. It has mutated the L1 object only, right? Now let's try to do the same thing with the adding the name property here in the add method. Now we know that because when we call the add method or like add operator, it will directly call it will directly create a new object, right? So it takes the other object and self itself, right? And then it creates a new object of the same class. So here we are returning my class, and then we are saying name plus other name. So this will make sure to create a new object. And when we call the iadd, now remember when we create the iadd, it has just mutated the same object. So when the iadd, we are just changing the name value itself, right? Here we are not creating the new object, but we are changing the name value, right? We are just adding a new string to the name value itself, right? And now let's try to do this. When we run this, here we have the two object. Now when we call C1 plus C2, now again we have seen that it will create new object, so we have created this object. Now this does not mean C1 and C2 have not changed. C1 and C2 is still there. it's the same object. It has not impacted C1 and C2, but itself it has created a new object. But when we call C1 plus equal to C2, it has created a new object. So it has not created a new object. It has just mutated the C1 object. We can see that over here. Again, when we check the C1, now here we can see that the C1 have changed. That means it has just mutated the C1. And in this way, when we call this method plus equal to, it has called iadd method. And when we call plus method, it has called add method, right? Now let's try to implement star and star equal to operator. For this, we have the mul and the imul method, right? And again, we can see that in the mul, we know that it will create a new object. So itself here we are getting a new object with the my class. And then the value inside is will multiply that. So here we are repeating the string value n number of time. But when we call the imul method, that means that means star equal to operator, right? In this, we are just changing the name value. Here we are not creating the object, but again we are repeating the string that n number of time, right? Let's do this. Here we have this C1. When we do C1 into 3, we can see that it has created a new object. So C1 is still there. We have not changed the C1. But when we call C1 plus equal to 4, this means that C1 have changed. We can see that C1 have changed, right? Now, if we'll try to add or if we'll try to multiply with the other type of value rather than integer, we'll get error. And here we can see that Python is automatically handling the correct type of error. So we'll not implement this. We do not have to implement this, right? What happens if you multiply the integer by the sequence? So we know that C1 into 3 is working, but does this work? 2 into C1? This will not work, right? For that, we have to implement this rmul method, right? And this rmul method work is here we are just implementing the rmul, and then we are saying that self.name plus equal to n. That's it. That's it. So when we call this 2 into C1, this method will call and it will automatically give you the output, right? Here we have the C1 when we call 2 into C1. Now here, the one thing to note is it has not create like it has not mutated the same object. Though we have written this way, it has created a new object because we have called in this way. But when you call 2 2 into equal to C1, we cannot call this, right? We have to call this C1 into equal to 2, right? So this will work. Now let's see the implementation of in operator. Now when we use the in operator, we generally check whether this particular object is contained in the other object or not. So for in operator, we have to implement the contain method. Now here, now if every code is same, here we are just implementing the contain method, and then we are checking that whether this value is present in name or not, right? So let's run this. Here we have the C1, and now we are trying to check that Ty in C1. Basically, it will check that whether this Ty is present in Monty or not, right? And then if it is, then it will return the value. Here we get in true over here, right? So this is how we can implement the custom sequence data. Thank you very much.